What's up, fisher people? We're kicking it in the classroom today, talking about spring walleye locations. We're going to focus on natural lakes, and there should be enough stuff in here that's pretty universal that should help you out any lake that you're hunting walleyes sometime in the spring.
Yes!
So stick around.
There's the stuff. Oh, got him. That is such a pretty fish. That is. Oh, it's a big walleye. I don't know. 21, 22. Dandy fish.
Before we can even begin to talk about the locations though, the most important thing to know is what part of the cycle are you in? Have the fish laid their eggs or not? Pre-spawn, post-spawn, somewhere in the middle. Now when they spawn depends on two things. One of them is water temperature and the other is photo period, which is basically the date on the calendar. So they're gonna prefer to lay their eggs in about 42 to 48 degree water. That said, they're only gonna deviate so much from that photo period. So if the ice out is super late, sometimes fish have even been known to lay their eggs under the ice and there basically is no pre-spawn bite unless you're ice fishing. And if it's really slow to warm up, they're only gonna wait so long and they might start early. If it warms up really fast, it might be 50 degree water already before they even start spawning. And some of these lakes, especially smaller natural lakes, this can happen pretty quickly. You might have ice out and then you got 70, 80 degrees the next day of air temperature. Kicks that water temp up quite a bit right away and they might go just like that the next day. So there's a lot of variables, but water temp is a pretty good key. And if you have an idea of when fish typically spawn in the lake that you're looking at, that's super helpful as well. Now, of course, if you've identified whether or not they've spawned, it's also helpful to know where these spawning locations are because pre-spawn, they're gonna stage in areas somewhat nearby those spawning locations. Post-spawn, some of the fish are still gonna hang around those exact spawning locations for a few days, maybe a week or two. Those are gonna be the males, which are milking the eggs.
Milk and male. That is our fifth one of the day. Yeah, that was, you know what happened.
The females typically get in and out one night, so they're gonna hang out in the areas nearby before they lay the eggs, drop the eggs, and they're gonna be gone already. They're gonna drop off the first break. They're gonna go across to some kind of mud flat perhaps. They might even run out to a deep piece of structure right away to recuperate, or maybe even start feeding right away. So you're gonna find those females and males in totally different places. If you're finding milking males, typically you're not gonna find a whole lot of big females in the same area. So nevertheless, where do they spawn? Well, typically they're gonna wanna find some current. So you're gonna look for some kind of inlet, or if there's like a creek arm or something like that, or if there's a bay, which keeps things somewhat protected, but still get some wind action going in there to move the water around, that helps. They need to oxygenate the eggs, that's the key. So wherever they're gonna be, hopefully there's some prevailing winds blowing in that spot at a minimum, if not current, and that's gonna be a more likely spawning location for the walleyes. That said, it does depend pretty heavily on what your lake looks like. Like if it's something like this, a lake that's got a ton of nooks and crannies and bays and fingers, you have a lot of varieties and a lot of different areas where they could spawn. But if your lake looks like this, on the other hand, where it's basically just a big bowl, maybe a few little bumps here and there in the shore that you could maybe call a bay, they're probably just gonna spawn on the main lake. They're gonna be looking for spots where prevailing winds are hitting most of the time. And you know, everybody's heard that walleyes like to spawn on rocks. That's somewhat true. Like typically what they're looking for is small gravel. They're not looking for boulders. They're just looking for little nooks where the eggs can settle into to be protected a little bit. And in some lakes that happens to just be sand. So if you're definitely in the pre-spawn period, you might want to key in on some of these areas, but if the fish aren't there, you're going to want to look in nearby areas, maybe look off some of those breaks, some slightly deeper water. They're not necessarily always going to be shallow pre-spawn, especially if the air temperature is cold and you get a cold front. They might be hanging in slightly deeper water. But if it is nice and warm, you do want to look for warm water even pre-spawn period, because there's typically going to like to raise their metabolism to prep for the spawn, build some energy. So that'd be nice if it occurs. And by the way, some people also might be thinking, well, what if my lake doesn't have natural walleye reproduction? That is true in a lot of cases, especially lakes that are stocked. But the thing is, they're still going to go through the motions. They're still going to drop eggs and they're still going to fertilize eggs, even if they don't survive. So most of this stuff is going to hold true, whether or not you've heard there's actually natural reproduction in this lake that you're targeting. And now we're going to get into the post-spawn period, Although if you're right in the middle of the spawn, and some of this is going to happen in stages, not every fish spawns at exactly the same time. So if you're thinking that fish are actively spawning, you're going to be kind of looking at a little pre-spawn idea and a little post-spawn idea, trying to guess what's going on in a certain area. But the most important thing post-spawn, absolutely for sure, is warm water. And where do you find warm water? Well, typically shallower water is warmer water, and oftentimes bays are going to have some of that shallower water. Now, I typically like to see some kind of a minimum when it comes to walleyes. If there's a massive sprawling bay that's literally 1.5 feet of water, that might not be an ideal location. But if you're dealing with a bay that's, 5 to 10 feet deep, that could be a golden zone. Whether the fish actually spawn in that bay or not, that could help, but they're at least going to seek out these areas once they're done spawning to look for that warmer water, juice the metabolism, and start feeding heavily. The other thing that can make some warm waters is areas that have some runoff. So some of that rainwater, or if you got like a creek inlet or something, some kind of current areas, that water could be warmer than the main lake where that's coming in. So that can also be a pretty good key too, depending on what lake you're on, if it has something like that. And typically you're looking for flat-ish areas. Like you're not looking for steep drops and cuts and things like that post-spawn period. More than likely, they're gonna be in shallow, flat type of areas, a lot of sand, potentially mud, maybe a little bit of rock reef stuff. If your lake happens to have weeds and the weeds are starting to grow, weeds can definitely be a thing, but you're looking for flats. For the most part this time period, you don't really care if there's a lot of drop-offs and steep topography. And then one of the oldest walleye adages is always fish the windswept side, and that especially holds true in the spring because wind moves warmer water. Wherever that warm water is, where the wind's blowing to, the surface water is warmer than what's underneath, and that surface water is what's moving with the wind. So you always want to look for wind-blown areas. You also want to look for stained water because stained water is capable of holding more heat. So if you can find windswept, stained water on a flat, you're probably going to catch some post-spawn walleyes. And not all fish do the same things at the same time. There will be some fish that are deeper. However, they might not be as active. So I typically like to focus on 10 foot and less when it comes to post-spawn walleye fishing. You can find some deeper ones, but they're going to be tougher to trigger. If you find the ones that are up shallow, more than likely you're going to have a field day on those compared to those deeper holding fish. So given all of what we just said, obviously side imaging is a huge asset during the spring time period because you can see a lot of fish in these shallow areas. You're not going to see them on sonar more than likely. Forward-facing sonar can be somewhat helpful, but side imaging is probably more helpful and more efficient to actually locate fish. So if you have access to side imaging, hugely productive for spring walleye fishing, hugely productive. So again, to zero that into the type of lake that you're fishing, if you do have one of those big bull lakes, the most important thing you're looking for is windblown, stained water, where's the water temp higher? If you are fishing one of those lakes that has a ton of nooks and crannies and other little fancy stuff, finding those shallower bay nooks and crannies and stuff like that is definitely going to be a good location. Even if it's not necessarily windswept, the water temp is probably going to be warmer, and then you might find some hungry walleyes out of the wind just looking to sunbathe. So keep this in mind the next time that you're out there chasing spring walleyes on natural lakes specifically, and hopefully it's going to help you catch at least a few more fish than before you saw the video. Oh, and if you want to watch some other spring walleye fishing videos, I got a lot of that stuff too. So if you don't just want to sit in the classroom and geek out, you can actually watch some fishing action. So go check out some other videos, please. Maybe subscribe, maybe hit the like button. You know the stuff to do. If you enjoyed this video and you think you might want some more help breaking down one of your favorite lakes in your area, I do offer this as a service in my paid Patreon subscription, the top $50 tier, which you can find at patreon.com/Bloemendaal fishing. And I also offer it as a one-time service on my website, which you can find at bloemendaalfishing.com. I'll break down the maps depending on times of season, give you a little help and insight, and have about a 1-hour phone call if that's something you're interested in. Keep that in mind. Now you know where to find me. You know what happened. Not sure how I feel about that. Well, I know how I feel about that. Not good. Payback sometimes is unfriendly.